Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to this lore video, being the last proper faction lore video before I start into the minor factions and various pieces of lore. It is the Dark Elves of, well, technically Ulthuan, but currently Naggaroth. The Dark Elves do not refer to themselves as Dark Elves, by the way. That, much like High Elves, is a name that we mere mortals have thrust upon them. The Dark Elves themselves call themselves the Drukai, or the Druchi, whichever pronunciation you subscribe to. Now, I'm gonna have to go over a little bit of the same ground as I did with the High Elves, simply because, well, you know, the High Elves and the Dark Elves used to be one people. So, whereas with the High Elves I went through all of their kings, the Dark Elves has only ever had one king, Malekith, the Witch King. So, as for their origin story, I will tell you the story of Malekith. Malekith was the first and only son of Anarion the Defender and Morathi, the, Witch Queen, Bitch Queen, and many other equally flattering names that has been given to her, used to be both High Elves. Well, Anarion was always a High Elf, but Morathi was even then considered to be a little bit, eccentric, shall we just say, and there are rumors that even from the very beginning, when she first, well, married, technically, Anarion, she was already a worshipper of Slaanesh, which was to prove just a slight problem in the future of the High Elves. But whether or not she was already corrupted, her son Malekith was not originally corrupted, and you could make the argument that he still is not corrupted by chaos. Even though he is a bit of an angsty bitch, he might not technically be a tool of the Dark Gods. There are various theories on that, but we'll get to that later. To begin with, Malekith was assumed to be the logical heir to the Phoenix King's throne by simple right of birth. Now, of course, the High Elves did not actually have a hereditary succession system, but being the son of Anarion the Defender, Malekith naturally assumed that he was simply going to be the next king. However, many of the High Elf nobles took a rather dim view to the idea of Malekith being the Witch King, as he had a fairly short temper and tended to solve pretty much every problem with mindless and senseless violence. And having had quite enough of that under his daddy Anarion, the princess decided that perhaps someone a teensy-weensy bit more level-headed was called for. Now that after all the demon hordes were driven back, they were looking at an era of hopefully peace, and as such, a blood-crazed maniac with a daddy issue and some severe anger problems was probably not the best ruler they could have hoped for. And as such, instead of Malekith, they elected Belshazzar, the Prince of Tiranoc, to be the next Phoenix King. Malekith, of course, was not overly pleased by this, but realizing that little was to be gained from just, bitching and yelling at the new king, he instead decided that he would take the long view, and was amongst the first to swear loyalty to Belshazzar. Whether or not this oath of fealty was ever entirely sincere is questionable, to say the absolute least, but for many years he served Belshazzar faithfully, and was at one point even appointed as the ambassador to the dwarves in Karasa Karak, making him one of very few elves to actually have set foot inside that most impregnable of fortresses. Malekith continued to prove his worth as a general in countless wars against the orcs and goblins and the followers of chaos, and it was in one of these expeditions to the frozen north that he discovered the magical item known as the Circlet of Iron, a talisman of quite magnificent magical power, but of course also imbued with demonic power, so there is an argument to be made that Malekith was honestly serving the Phoenix King Belshazzar until being twisted by the powers of chaos, although, again, with the modern-day version of Malekith being at best a passive supporter of Slaanesh, it's a little bit hard to tell. Regardless, this was around the time when Malekith seemed to have had enough with playing the loyal servant, and decided to set a bit of a plan in motion to get himself what was rightfully his, after all, the Phoenix Throne. His mother, Morathi, had long been infiltrating High Elf society at the head of the so-called Cult of Pleasure, a very, very thinly veiled cult of Slaanesh. When the activities of the cult came to light and it became blindingly obvious that it was a cult of Slaanesh, the Phoenix King Belshazzar, of course, immediately outlawed the cult, as well the High Elves were not great fans of the Chaos Powers, having almost been wiped out by them a couple hundred years ago. Malekith, feigning outrage at this heretical cult in the midst of the High Elves, appeared to be fighting with remarkable ferocity against the cult, becoming essentially the High Inquisitor and second in power only to the Phoenix King himself, as it appeared that he was arresting cult followers left and right. Of course, as we now know today, the vast majority of those cult followers weren't actually cult followers, but rather followers of Belshazzar. And by doing this, Malekith managed to build himself a considerable power base, with large parts of the High Elf army already loyal to him after his various wars with the Orcs and Goblins and Chaos Powers, and now having imprisoned, tortured, or killed the vast majority of the High Elf nobles that were hostile to him, Malekith had secured himself a power base from which to make his move. He accused the Phoenix King Belshazzar of being the leader of the Cult of Pleasure, and shortly thereafter Belshazzar died from poisoning. Malekith, of course, claimed that he poisoned himself to avoid the dishonor of interrogation and rightful vengeance and all of that nonsense, and of course the Phoenix King's supporters found it just a little bit convenient that their Phoenix King just decided to poison himself a few hours after being accused of being a Chaos worshipper. Malekith summoned a council of the princes to elect the new Phoenix King, although when the council was formed, he essentially just flat out demanded that obviously the princes could not be counted upon to make such an important decision, considering they voted into power a Chaos worshipper and all that, and as such, the only choice was of course Malekith. When the princes disagreed rather vehemently, Malekith decided that, I've got enough of this whole diplomacy, politics, and democracy thing, and just killed the remaining princes that were in opposition to him. Thinking that he was already considered the rightful Phoenix King, he marched confidently into the sacred flame of the god Assyrian, and was burned into a crisp, which later on turns out during the whole end times thing was merely a bloody joke, but let's not talk about that. Anyways, the newly crisped Malekith stumbled from the flames the same way he had come into the flames, and his followers, frankly rather surprised by the fact that their god Assyrian had just said, "Nah, bitch, you are not the Phoenix King just yet," panicked, essentially, and carried his now nicely roasted body back to the safety of his castle. The remaining High Elf nobles were not entirely happy with this turn of event, despite the fact that Malekith of course claimed that it was the High Elf nobles that attacked him, and he merely defended himself by poisoning them. Yes, that's a piece of propaganda right there, that's just beautiful. I mean, hell, even Soviet Union at the worst times could usually spin a better lie than that, but oh well. Naturally, the High Elf nobles declared war on Malekith because, well, duh, at this point, thinking that it would be a short campaign. After all, how much support could Malekith possibly have after even their god Assyrian had thrown him screaming from the fire? However, as has been proven throughout human history so bloody many times, it is a bloody marvel that it still fucking works. People are willing to believe pretty much anything as long as it is repeated loudly enough and often enough, and as such, Malekith still had a considerable following, amongst which was of course his mother Morathi. who had used her feminine powers to garner the support of a priest of Val, the elven god of smithing. The renegade priest had destroyed many of the High Elves' most powerful artifacts and had stolen many of their secrets for themselves, and used these secrets to craft a suit of black iron for Malekith. This magical suit fused to Malekith's blackened body while it was still hot from the forges piece by piece, which, considering he had recently been burned half to death, you'd think this would probably finish him off, but nope, he was a hardy little son of a bitch, if nothing else. And through the magical properties of this armor, he arose more powerful than ever, more powerful both in mind, soul, and body. And now that he was clad essentially top to bottom in chaos armor, he looked like a proper bad guy, so the fact that he still considered himself the good guy and people still believed him I'm almost kind of tempted to call it a joke from the side of Games Workshop, seeing as Malekith was created back in the day when they didn't take themselves too seriously. After all, you would think it'd be pretty hard to present a brute, clad top to bottom in pitch-black chaos armor spikier than a hedgehog, to be the champion of light and all the good justice-y things, but nevertheless, that is how he presented himself. Meanwhile, the remaining High Elves had elected the next Phoenix King to be Imric of Caledor, the third Phoenix King, and the High Elf civil war known as the Sundering continued. However, Malekith, having now clad himself in pitch-black spiky armor and, poisoned the vast majority of his former allies and, killed the previous Phoenix King and leading a cult of pleasure and various other less than trust-inspiring things, the vast majority of the High Elf population had started to suspect that, maybe, just maybe this guy wasn't all that much of a good guy after all, and had started to flock to the banner of Imric, now calling himself Caledor I. Heavily outnumbered, Malekith threw everything he had in one last desperate battle against the High Elf forces, and duelled Caledor I high over the battlefield on the back of a dragon. Caledor I, being, a prince of Caledor, also had himself a nice big fire-breathing lizard, and in the end, his giant fire-breathing lizard proved to be more potent than Malekith's. Slaying Malekith's steed, Malekith then fell, one assumes, a few hundred meters directly down onto the ground, which magically did not squish his innards upon, suddenly stopping upon meeting the ground, and he survived, although he was at least a little bit bruised, because that's what usually happens to someone who falls a few hundred meters down onto the hard ground. They get up, but at least they're not entirely fine. Like I said previously, do bear in mind that this was back in the day when Games Workshop did not take themselves all that seriously, and so having one of their characters fall a few hundred meters onto the hard ground was considered, at worst, a slight impediment of his potential combat powers. However, his Dark Elf followers were not quite so optimistic. Having seen their brave, glorious leader take a bit of a tumble, they decided that they would probably be better off saving themselves rather than fighting on for their newfound Phoenix King. At this point, Malekith's optimism was beginning to wane just a little bit. Having had his arse handed to him at every single turn, he decided that, well, if I can't have Ulthuan, then nobody can have it, and in one of the finest displays of I am taking my ball and going home, he decided to try and sink the entire bloody elven homeland beneath the waves, because douchebag, that's pretty much why. Malekith instructed his coven of sorcerers to undo the spell that bound the vortex of Ulthuan, the great magical spell that sucked in chaos power, nullifying it and keeping the island of Ulthuan afloat both at the same time. Of course, Malekith was perfectly aware of the fact that if he failed at undoing the spell and then recasting it for his own benefit, then chaos would simply just sweep over the world and everybody would die, but like I said, he is taking his ball and he is going home. However, as with every single other attempt Malekith had done to this point, he of course did not pull it off because, well, you know, bad guys. They can't win all the time, can they? And so his spell was thwarted. However, even when the spell failed, it was a spell of such apocalyptic magnitude that it had some pretty severe side effects, causing tidal waves 1,000 feet high and massive earthquakes to rack the continent of Ulthuan, submerging the provinces of Nagaroth, the homeland of Malekith, and Tiranoc, and killing thousands, if not tens of thousands of elves. However, having foreseen this potential outcome, Malekith and his sorcerer's covens had prepared spells on the fortresses and strongholds of those loyal to him. These spells tore the fortresses from the lands of Ulthuan, bearing them across the waves as floating fortresses, being known today as the Black Arks of Nagaroth. Realizing, however, that the meagre forces he had been able to save would not be enough to stop the rather considerable wrath of the High Elves, Malekith decided to retreat from Ulthuan to the icy north. But, of course, before doing so, he swore vengeance upon the evil High Elves who had so viciously betrayed him and denied him his rights, those evil, conniving bastards that they are, after all. However, oaths of vengeance notwithstanding, Malekith and his forces were rather soundly beaten, and had to retreat to the icy north, where he settled in the land that they now called Nagaroth, the Land of Chill. And despite almost being wiped out by a horde of Chaos Marauders, Malekith struck some sort of deal with the Chaos followers that saved his remaining followers from the rather brutal attention of the worshippers of Chaos, although exactly what this compact was is not entirely known. In the current timeline of Warhammer, the land of Nagaroth is heavily fortified, the Dark Elves having sworn that they would never again be driven to the brink of extinction by some half-naked furry savages, having built dozens of massive fortresses to protect their new homeland, their massive black arcs being primarily used for raiding purposes along the coasts of the Old World and Ulthuan. And up until the current day in Warhammer, he has invaded Ulthuan several times, although he has never quite been able to pull off any significant victories that allowed him to even get really close, honestly, to get back into power. Now, let's talk a little bit about the land of Nagaroth itself, shall we? The land of Nagaroth, as you can see on the map, is pretty far up in the desolate north. It is not a very hospitable land by any stretch of the imagination, and even how the High Elves actually survive in the area is not entirely explained by the fluff, seeing as the land is said to be essentially completely and utterly infertile. It's pretty hard to imagine that they're growing any real amount of crops unless through magical means, which is certainly possible. The Dark Elves is a rather magical race, and of course they could probably sustain themselves on fishing and hunting to a certain degree, but considering that the fluff is very inconsistent on exactly how many Dark Elves there are, some sources of fluff claiming that there are hundreds of thousands of the bastards, and other sources saying there are merely thousands or tens of thousands. Another possible explanation is that it is said that the Dark Elves have discovered vast underground labyrinths that connect their 6 primary cities, and these labyrinths are apparently choked with water in many ways, being called underground waterways in the fluff, so they could certainly grow a fair bit of, fungus and other things to keep themselves alive down there, but, the Dark Elves are not exactly the greatest lover of simple foods, being a bit of a Slaneshi cult, so one would question if they would be entirely happy about living off a diet consisting entirely of fungus and fish, but, oh well, 'tis a fantasy universe after all. You probably have to accept a few inconsistencies. Now, I said that there were 6 cities. Well, the 6 cities are the capital, Nagarond, which is described to be one of the largest population centers in the Warhammer world, which again makes you go like, okay. Well, considering Altdorf, the capital of the Empire, houses hundreds of thousands of humans, not to mention Skaven settlements contain literally hundreds, if not millions of people, again, you're kind of in the position where a lot of the fluff says that the elven race is a waning race and they're very low on numbers, and on the other hand you've got stuff like this, saying that there are quite literally hundreds of thousands of them in a single bloody city, so, I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. Personally, I think that there is still a fair few elves around, numbering probably in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, considering the fact that, well, we know that there are probably millions of humans, and we know for damn sure that there are millions of Skaven, so if you consider the High Elves to be a waning population, then even if there was 1 million or 2 of them, there would still be quite a lot, although not quite as ridiculously many as the other races, so you have to make up your own mind a little bit on that, as, like I said, some pieces of fluff says that there's literally just a few thousand of them left, which is somewhat odd, considering they are constantly launching major invasions of, well, everywhere, so one has to wonder where the hell they're actually getting this military force from, but, oh well. I was talking about the cities, so let's move on. The next city is Grond, the northernmost city, and the main hub of worship, where the Temple of Kaela Mensha Cain is located. This is also where the Witch Elves have their primary residence. Then there is Karond Kar, an island fortress that houses the holding pens and slave markets of the Beastmasters, being, one could probably say, the economic heart of the Dark Elf lands of Nagaroth, being an economy primarily based off slave labor, after all. Then there is Har Garneth, the home of the, infamous Executioner's Order, a bunch of very, very angry Dark Elves wielding massive two-handed swords. And Hag Graf, a mining and production centre, with Klar Karond being the last one, being the primary lumber mills and shipyards of the Dark Elves. Again, you've kinda gotta ask yourself where the hell they're getting all of this lumber in the desolate north that is said to be mostly blasted wastelands, but, sure, I guess they ship it in from somewhere. Well, it's not completely insane, because, well, Lustria is not that far off to the south, and there are plenty of trees in Lustria, so yeah, you could certainly make an argument for that. As for the Dark Elf economy, well, I mentioned that it was already primarily based around slave trade, and it is, almost to, well, an exclusive extent, really. There being very little in the frozen north, so you have a fairly limited base of production when it comes both to food and, goods. So they steal the vast majority of, well, what they have. There is a fair bit of mineral resources up in the north, so they've got a fair bit of, weapons and armor manufactories and general metal working, but even that is somewhat limited and mostly carried out by slaves because, well, grubbing in the dirt and stuff is not a task for a proper Dark Elf after all. The way the Dark Elves acquire these slaves is via their raiding fleets. The largest of these raiding fleets are led by the Black Arks, the massive floating fortresses that were formerly in Ulthuan. However, there are not that many of these massive Black Arks, and while numbers vary, you can probably assume that there's a dozen or so of them, circa-ish. Like I said, the numbers vary quite a lot, so that is my best guess, essentially. So the vast majority of the Dark Elf raiding fleets is just that, fleets of fast, well-crafted elven ships that use a bit of a Viking method, really, hitting isolated coastal settlements and sailing up rivers to attack unsuspecting settlements, stripping them of valuables and people, and then returning back to Nagarond to sell their booty. Now, of course, as many of you probably are students of history, You probably know that any nation with a massive amount of slaves usually has just a few problems with keeping this population of slaves in order, and the Dark Elves are no different. But the Dark Elves have a bit of an advantage that we mere humans do not. While over the course of humans' history we have had some remarkably brutal slaving empires, even the worst of our history cannot really compare to the Dark Elves, who, well, they simply do not give the faintest of shits about their slaves, not even as commodities. Even the Romans, who were considered to be relatively ruthless slave masters, put a premium on their slaves and wouldn't just kill them or torture them just for kicks the vast majority of the time. The Dark Elves fetch slaves practically for the sole purpose of torturing and killing them, because, well, they find that shit rather amusing. And so, while there is a considerable slave population, they are mistreated and brutalized to such an extent that it's pretty damn hard to actually get any kind of rebellion going. If you have broken the mind and spirits of the vast majority of the slave population, it's pretty hard for them to find the motivation to actually try and, break out. Now, that does not mean that there has not been revolts. There have, and in fact, the primary threat to a Dark Elf's life when he's back in Nagorond, well, the secondary threat really, the primary threat being other Dark Elves wanting his shit, the secondary threat is really his slaves. Death by, well, servant is one of the leading causes of death in the Dark Elf society because, well, you can mistreat the bastard as much as you want and it's probably going to ensure a certain level of loyalty, but even the most mistreated of dogs, if given a knife and an opportunity, might just decide to take it. But, well, the Dark Elves have been taking slaves for a very, very long time, and as such they've gotten pretty damn good at it. So, the successful slave uprisings are few and far between, the majority of them happening at sea, because, well, there is a limit to how much even the most cautious of Dark Elf captains can actually do to keep the slaves from rampaging across his ship. And Dark Elves are also extremely greedy creatures, which often means that they decide that, the inferior races can't possibly pose a threat or anything, and so they take on far more slaves than they can actually safely handle. And even unarmed men can be a serious threat when they're outnumbering you 5-1. However, even so, the vast majority of slaving raids are successful. And again, according to the fluff, countless millions have been doomed to servitude in Nagorond, which, again, actually judging the population of the Warhammer world is nigh on impossible because you have so many conflicting sources, but yeah, putting the numbers in the high millions sounds relatively accurate all in all. And as for religion, the slaves serve a dual purpose. They are both the workforce and the primary source of sacrifices to the Dark Elves' primary god, Kaela Mensha Kane, the bloody-handed god, or the Lord of Murder. Now, the High Elves consider him to be, evil, but the Dark Elves, they considered him to be the face of justice and, proper things, because, well, he reminds them a bit of their lord Malekith, and yes, the two have remarkably similar headpieces, if nothing else. The Dark Elves do worship many of the other elven gods as well, but the worship of Kaela Mensha Kane is by far the most prominent, with every single Dark Elf noble required to donate a percentage of the slaves they capture to the temples as, well, sacrifices, monetary compensation, and just good old-fashioned menial labor. And while the worship of the bloody-handed god is split into several cults, some worshipping his aspect as a lord of murder as assassins, the largest cult are known as the Brides of Cain, or more commonly known by the normal races of the Warhammer universe as Witch Elves. The Witch Elves are an all-female cult of extremely skimpily clad women that dance around the battlefield using daggers to kill people, because, well, that's pretty much what their god does. The whole skimpily clad female part, I'm not entirely sure where it came from, but remember, this was created back in the goddamn early 80s, when this shit was still acceptable. The bikini armor notwithstanding, the Witch Elves consider the battlefield to be a holy place, and are, well, essentially considering their whole murder thingies to be an act of worship. And this is where the chaos comparisons come into play. The Brides of Cain are led by Malekith's mother, Morathi. Now, Morathi was the leader of the Cult of Pleasure, so that sounds like Slaanesh. Skimpily clad females dancing across the battlefield using not particularly lethal weapons like poison-coated daggers to inflict pain and suffering, that also sounds like Slaanesh. But then you go to the god they worship, Caola Menshi Cain, the bloody-handed god, the lord of murder, and, you know, the whole battlefield being a temple thing. That sounds like Khorne. And I've heard many arguments for Caola Menshi Cain simply being a minor aspect of Khorne, but again, like I have said uncountable times, and which I will probably say a million times again, I subscribe to the Liber Chaotica, and so Caola Menshi Cain is one of the old elven gods that were created back when the elves actually knew how to manipulate the warp, and as such I considered him to be his own, well, deity. That is not to say that the acts of the Brides of Cain do not feed the Chaos powers in some way, because, yeah, they probably do, both Slaanesh and Khorne. And, you've got to remember, the Dark Elves technically do not worship Slaanesh directly, but they do still worship the Cult of Pleasure. They still do worship Morathi, essentially, as its leader, and of course they worship the Witch King as practically a god, although he's not quite at that level just yet. And so, at the very least, they indirectly worship Slaanesh. And this is the point where we try to touch a little bit on what actually the Dark Elves are. Now, you've probably already gathered to a certain extent that the Dark Elves are remarkably evil bastards, and yeah, they are. They have essentially turned torture into a bit of an art form, and it is one of their favourite pastimes. They will, without hesitance, kill slaves or even family members. Hell, internal family strife is quite common within Dark Elves families, with the most common form of succession being the current leader of the house dying in some tragic accident, usually involving, you know, a knife in the back or poisoned wine, you know, normal shit that just kinda happens every now and then. At least in Dark Elf society it does. But there is a ritual, a religious ritual amongst the Dark Elves that I think perfectly personifies just how much of a bastard race the Dark Elves really are. It is called the Death Night. It is the most sacred of nights for the worshippers of Caola Menshi Cain. What essentially happens is that every single witch elf, pretty much all of them, gets gathered up at the Temple of Murder and various smaller temples all across Dark Elves lands, and as soon as night hits, they start running through the streets, capturing and then torturing to death whoever they find, or even just killing them right on the spot, often even going so far as to breaking into houses, and then of course abducting and or killing whoever might reside within said house. They also steal away children, because, you know, witches, of course they do. The female children are trained to be witch elves, and the male children are thrown in a boiling cauldron of blood, because, again, why the hell not? And the ones who survive are turned into assassins, because, well, if they're tough enough to survive that as a baby, they're probably worth something. It is also customary that anyone who actually lives through the night offers a sacrifice to Cain, either a favoured servant or even elderly relatives, because, you know, once you break like 40, 50, there's really no more use for you, and you'd best be just, you know, killed off, because, like I said, the Dark Elves are pretty bad people. As for the system of, well, internal politics, the social structure of the Dark Elves, well, it's pretty damn simple, really. Every Dark Elf is, of course, far above all of the other silly races, because, well, while the High Elves consider themselves merely superior to the other races, the Dark Elves quite literally consider all of the other races to be less than animals, purely there to be used as slave labor and pretty much nothing else whatsoever ever. Oh, well, they're also used as sacrifices, so, yeah, they have a dual purpose. Within the Dark Elf society, though, there are of course different classes. The basic Dark Elves are all, well, there are very few poor and destitute Dark Elves, partially because, well, they get killed off really quickly by other Dark Elves for, well, just amusement, really. And because pretty much all Dark Elves are expected to fight, and in the Dark Elf army, that essentially means they're expected to be slavers, which means every Dark Elf essentially has the opportunity to get himself a decent amount of booty while out raiding. There are also really no Dark Elf farmers, so to say. That is again a slave thing. The Dark Elves are primarily either slavers, raiders, professional warriors, priests, merchantmen, or some other administrative task. They do not like doing anything overly manual. Even jewelry crafting is considered a little beneath them, but it's also considered a little bit too high of a task to give to a slave, which is why armor crafting is usually done by the Dark Elves themselves. And as for the politicking itself, well, there is quite a lot of internal politics within the family groups. The lieutenants of the Witch King is the 6 mayors, so to say, of the 6 great Dark Elf cities. These are the only ones in the Dark Elf Empire that are essentially protected from being assassinated by other Dark Elves, as they are protected by the Witch King. Only the Witch King gets to kill them, on a whim, if he so chooses. If other people kills his lieutenants, he gets rather pissy. But other than that, all Dark Elves are at more or less constant risk of getting killed by their fellow Dark Elves for, well, any number of reasons, really. Political standing, wealth, just stealing his shit, you know, pretty much whatever you can think of. It's not a very safe society. As for outside politics, well, the Dark Elves don't really have much in the way of politics. They consider themselves so infinitely superior to all of the other races that even the mere thought of maintaining diplomatic relations is considered just a wee bit abhorrent, really. They have, on several occasions, been known to recruit mercenaries in the form of ogres, green-skinned beastmen, or warriors of chaos, essentially anyone stupid enough to be bought and used as, well, cannon fodder, essentially. A mercenary contract with the Dark Elves is more often than not going to be a very short one, and there's a reasonably good chance you're not going to get paid either. I suppose the closest thing you can come to an alliance is that they have a bit of a raiding alliance with the Tomb King Cetra, whereas the two forces will unite in a rather uneasy alliance to raid the human nation of Tilea. It's... yeah, I guess you could call it kind of an alliance, as it is essentially military in nature, but an alliance in which both sides will happily allow the other to die for, well, no real reason, except the pleasure of watching the other bastard get killed. However, I would of course be horribly ignorant if I did not mention the fact that the Skaven are one of the few species, or in fact the only species, that actually has a treaty with the Dark Elves, a treaty of trade, research, and very, 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 very basic military cooperation. And the Dark Elves actually kind of honor the treaty, and the Skaven even honor it too, because, well, it's really, really goddamn beneficial to them. Are you kidding me? Access to one of the largest slaving networks in the bloody world. Oh, fantastic. But, of course, the two races will regularly backstab each other, but at this point, it's become so frequent, so anticipated, that the two races have kind of just grown a grudging admiration of each other. They kind of see the whole constant backstabbing as a bit of a sport now. It's just a kind of thing they do. You know, I'd like to compare it to the Native American Indians, which would regularly steal from each other, and even steal, you know, people, and anything they could really get a hold of, and they considered it little more than jokes, which sounds pretty damn ridiculous from a human standpoint in a modern-day setting. I mean, shit. They were stealing people's children and wives and stuff, and they considered that to be like, haha, got you. You know? But that is essentially the kind of relationship that the Skaven have gotten into with the Dark Elves. So, if anyone should have a kind of alliance with the Dark Elves, it should probably be the Skavens, which is why I would kind of like to see an expansion that introduces the High Elves and Bretonnia, or the Wood Elves and Bretonnia. Either or, I kinda maybe prefer the Wood Elves, but at the same time, you can't really make that much of a cause for why the Wood Elves would suddenly start conquering their neighbors and that stuff, so... High Elves and Bretonnia versus Dark Elves and Skaven, because these are kind of traditional enemies. The Skavens have been dicking on Bretonnia for decades, and the Bretonnians take a strong dislike to the Skaven, considering them the cause of pretty much everything bad that has happened to Bretonnia for the last few hundred years, and they particularly blame the Skaven for the whole fall of Musilon thing, although, granted, the Bretonnians don't actually know that the Skaven are Skaven, they just consider them particularly dickish beastmen. But to try and wrap it up, the last few things I would like to mention, I will touch closer upon the army composition, of course, in the army video, but just to bring it up here. The positions of officers, and perhaps even more importantly, the positions of captains, are pretty much completely reserved for those of higher birth. A low-born Dark Elf could potentially become a captain if he, for example, killed the previous captain, you know, stuff like that. But hereditary, it is pretty much always the sons of nobility that get the juicy tasks. And, well, nobility... I would describe the Dark Elves as a very feudal noble society, except for the fact that the noble families are almost constantly in flux. Because the sons of nobility kills their fathers, brothers kill brothers, and upstart families continuously overthrow older families, so it's kind of a meritocracy, really, when you think about it, with elements of nobility, so... I don't even know if we actually have a word for that, to be honest. If we have a word for a system that combines a very powerful and harsh meritocracy where betrayal and poisoning and assassination, all that things are just perfectly peachy, but also retains a high amount of special privileges for the noble class. I'm not entirely sure. If you know, then by all means enlighten me. One final thing that should be mentioned about Dark Elf society is the so-called Prophecy of Demise. This happened before, well, Malekith even appeared. When Anarion removed the sword of Kealamensha Cain, Widowmaker, from the Temple of Cain, his best little buddy Kalidor Dragon Tamer made a prophecy. The prophecy refers to someone with a dark hand and a shadowy touch, ruling upon the land with a steel of skin. And it also mentioned that he is to be at war with men, dwarf, and elves, and to generally inspire fear, which sounds a lot like Malekith the Witch King. But the real thing about this whole prophecy is that a noble son will rise to power and learn the dark arts of magic, raising an army of terrible beasts and thereby bringing down the Dark King, slain by neither blade nor arrow but by sorcerous power of darkest magic. And Malekith, of course, thinks that this sounds a lot like him as well, and has therefore outlawed the practicing of dark magic by males in his nation. The only ones who are allowed to learn magic are the sorceresses joining the Dark Covenant, which is kind of a nunnery on steroids, really, as the Covenant members are ritually married off to the Witch King, you know, kind of like the whole nunnery thing where they take vows of celibacy and all of that swearing to God and stuff, because Malekith, to the Dark Elves, is, well, virtually a godlike existence. They are, of course, disallowed from ever bearing children, because, you know, a child of a sorceress has pretty damn good chances of having a bit of a magical potential himself, and, well, best not take that particular chance. However, Dark Elf male sorcerers do exist. They are generally forced to keep a very low profile because if the Witch King or any of his more or less loyal retainers hear about it, the odds are that he's going to suffer a very, very long and drawn-out death. And while various pieces of Warhammer fluff has on occasion tried to break that rule, like the MMO Warhammer Online that stated that, yeah, the males who received special dispensation to practice their dark arts from Malekith himself, and that, no, why would he? That's actually ridiculous. But they did that so we could play male sorcerers, so that the feminazis would not crawl all the way up their assholes and go like, why are there only skimpily clad females? Why? But at least they didn't make male witch elves, cause that... oh, gods no. Anyways, I think that's been pretty much all for the Dark Elves. I will of course be continuing to make lore videos on various subjects from now on, but this has been the last of the major lore and army videos. I'm probably going to attempt to be making a few shorter videos in the future, like 20 minutes or odd, maybe 30. But there is of course a few minor factions left, like Kislev and the Chaos Dwarves, that will be receiving the full Arch treatment. So, until then, I thank you very much for watching, I hope to see you next time, and have a good day.